Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the Genshin Impact 5.8 banner review. Ineffa is about to be released, and she's gonna be running alongside a Citlali rerun. And we have Sethos, Fischl, and Xingqiu. Weapon banner, obviously their respective signatures, alongside Favonius Bow, Sturdy Bone, Mountain Bracing Bolt, Fav Codex, and Sacrificial Greatsword. So, let's yap. First is obviously Ineffa. Now, I've talked about Ineffa a decent amount, but Ineffa got changed again since the last video I recorded on her, which was the pre-release video. Ineffa got her snapshot removed. The main change is that in Ineffa's default sensible teams, I'm gonna call them, right? The teams where you're actually playing Taser, Ineffa's power didn't really change. But the removal of the snapshot makes Bennett a lot worse with her, which hurts the synergy for the Taser teams that slot in Bennett as a last slot quite a bit. And it hurts the synergy with Chaska as well. So overall, those specific teams got weaker, and I'd say that it kind of hurt Ineffa's versatility. But just because she's now a bit less versatile doesn't mean she's weak. A lot of her good teams didn't get affected by the snapshot changes at all. Anyways, Ineffa, what the heck is she? What does she do? Ineffa is a 5-star electro polearm that is a pseudo reaction focused support. She gives you a shield, which is relevant to some teams, but that's not the main part of her kit. You're playing her mainly as an off-field damage dealer that is heavily incentivized to be used in Taser teams. We've had one similar to that before, which was Auron. But Auron had alternatives to Taser. If you didn't trigger Electro Charge, you could still trigger his effects with Natlan characters, right? As long as they entered Night Soul mode and they dealt Night Soul aligned damage, Auron would still be able to function. With Ineffa, you need to trigger Electro Charge, or I suppose in this case it's not Electro Charge, it's Lunar Charge. Ineffa's kit is basically Fischl 2. Her skill is a skill that you deploy and it deals off-field damage. It also gives you a shield, but you deploy the skill and deals off-field damage. And her burst, just like Fischl burst, refreshes the off-field duration and deals a little bit of damage. She's balanced differently, right? Her burst deals more damage than Fischl's burst, but her skill deals a lot less damage. But in exchange for that, she has an Ascension passive that basically makes her skill do a lot more damage after you've triggered Lunar Charged. When Ineffa's on your team, every time you would trigger Electro Charge, you trigger Lunar Charged instead. Lunar Charged, kind of like Electro Charged, allows Hydro and Electro Auras to coexist on enemies, and it deals damage over time. But the way it functions is fairly different. Electro Charge only has one trigger character, right? So if you apply Hydro and Electro, it just looks at the most recent element applied. If the most recent element was applied by Fischl, it'll calculate Electro Charge damage based on Fischl's level and elemental mastery. Lunar Charge, on the other hand, calculates its damage based on the application of everyone who participated. Other than that, Lunar Charged can crit, which means that it doesn't just care about level and EM, it cares about level, EM, and crit. And finally, the base damage for Lunar Charge is fairly similar to Electro Charge, but the EM scaling is a lot worse. Does that mean you don't want to build EM? No. But it does mean that on fairly high EM characters, Lunar Charge that doesn't crit is going to hurt a lot less than an Electro Charge does. In other words, the fact that Lunar Charge can crit doesn't mean that it's just significantly better, right? You're not gaining all the damage you have from the crit. It's basically just there to balance out how much worse the EM scaling is. The way the damage formula works is a little complicated. I've explained it in the pre-release video. You can go watch that. That one hasn't changed. But basically, it calculates the personal contribution to Lunar Charge of each character that applied an element. It takes the biggest number and it adds to that a portion of the other numbers. The second highest number is divided by 2. All of those things considered, Lunar Charge hurts more than Electro Charge does. However, it also hits less often. Electro Charge, by default, has a tick rate of about once per second. Lunar Charge is once every 2 seconds. All in all, because the stats that Lunar Charge scales with are also the stats that your characters want to build, right? Your Electro and Hydro characters generally don't scale with only EM. They generally scale with, well, their talent values, which scale with crit. Ineffa herself is an attack scaler, and we'll see in a second, also has some EM scaling in her kit. So you end up with a decent amount of EM on your Ineffa and a bunch of crit, which means that you actually get the stats that increase your Lunar Charge damage, even if you're not building for Lunar Charge, which is not the case for Electro Charge. Electro Charge does not deal a lot of damage unless you're building a lot of EM. And most of the characters that would trigger Electro Charge, they don't have direct EM scaling. So if you're building EM, it's only for the Electro Charge damage. Which means that in Taser teams, generally, you don't end up building your Hydro or Electro characters full EM. Because it's difficult to have one character always be the trigger, because the Electro Charge damage is calculated based on the last application, whether it's Hydro or Electro. So unless your application is incredibly consistent, not just fast, but consistent, the exact same intervals, your aura and your trigger are going to change between your characters, right? So building one character full EM doesn't guarantee that your Electro Charges are doing more damage. Which means that in practice, generally, you don't actually build your Electro Charge character full EM, and so Lunar Charge does end up doing more damage. But the ceiling for Lunar Charge damage, at least the direct reaction Lunar Charge damage, will generally be lower than what you can expect on ceiling for Electro Charge damage. But like I said, in practice, most of the time, it is better. That being said, that's not the only thing Ineffa does, and like I said earlier, she does more when you trigger Lunar Charge. So the way that Lunar Charge works specifically is when you trigger the reaction, it spawns a cloud in the air, and every 2 seconds, the cloud deals damage to the enemies that are currently affected by both Hydro and Electro. Basically, instead of the reaction originating from the enemy that got targeted, it originates from something over the enemy that got targeted. That cloud, I'm not sure the exact duration, but I think it's like 5 seconds duration. It's a little bit longer than 2 seconds. And as long as that cloud is active, when Ineffa's skill hits enemies, it deals an additional instance of damage. And that additional instance of damage is considered Lunar Charge damage. If you've seen any footage on Ineffa, you've probably noticed that the Lunar Charge word, the text for Lunar Charge, appears much faster than once per 2 seconds. That's because you have the Lunar Charge reaction and you have the Lunar Charge direct damage from Ineffa's Ascension, right? You have 2 sources of Lunar Charge damage. The scaling on that Lunar Charge damage is 65% of Ineffa's attack, and her default skill damage every 2 seconds is 163. Thing is, Lunar Charge damage is cheating when it's talent damage. So you know how if you're triggering Vape with a Hydro unit, it doubles the damage? Well, if you're triggering Lunar Charge on talent damage, if you have talent damage that's considered Lunar Charge damage, it triples the damage. It doesn't say it anywhere, but it does. So the actual scaling on this is not 65, it's 195. On top of that, Lunar Charge damage is considered transformative reaction damage, so it does not get reduced by enemy defense. Enemy defense generally more or less divides her damage by 2. So it's basically the equivalent of more than 400 as opposed to this 163. But that's not all, because it's Lunar Charge damage, so it also gets increased by 14% multiplicatively from Ineffa's Ascension passive, and also by your Elemental Mastery multiplier that increases Lunar Charge damage, because it's a reaction, kind of like Vape and Melt. The scaling on Lunar Charge EM multiplier is somewhat similar to the Vape scaling. And so you can effectively build Ineffa the same way you build a Vape character. Anyways, all of this to say, this is not 65 versus 163. This is like 400 that gets increased by EM, and you get a bunch of EM because she has a passive that gives her EM. So it's like the equivalent of like 600 plus versus 160. So it's obviously the large majority of her personal damage. Over beta cycles, initially, Ineffa had a higher scaling on this and a higher scaling on this, and the Lunar Charged EM multiplier was a bit worse. The first change they made is they reduced this but increased the Lunar Charge multiplier, and then the next beta change they made was they reduced this from 80 to 65. That means that compared to her very first version of beta, the damage coming directly from her kit is a decent amount lower, but since the EM multiplier for Lunar Charge got increased, that also means that the Lunar Charge damage from the reaction itself is higher than it was initially. If you look at my first impressions video, I talked about Lunar Charge reaction being kind of insignificant. I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore. They basically nerfed a bunch of the rest of her kit and buffed the Lunar Charge itself. It's still not an insane deal. Like, you're still building Ineffa around her Ascension passive, not around the Lunar Charge itself, but it's more significant than it was at the start. Anyways, how good is it? Honestly, it's hard to say. It's pretty clear, even if you don't look at leaks, that Nodcry's gimmick is gonna be changed reactions, right? Like Natlan's gimmick was Night Soul stuff. Nodcry's gimmick is gonna be alternate reactions, like Lunar Charge. If you do look at leaks, you'll know that we are supposedly getting a Lunar Charged carry, Flynn's, in 6.0, and I know is supposedly a Hydro character that enables you to trigger both Lunar Charged and Lunar Bloom. It is very difficult to evaluate Ineffa's long-term value until we know what they're doing with those characters' kits. I looked at a few hypothetical scenarios for Flynn's, where I assumed that Flynn's is a character who does mostly direct Lunar Charge damage, like Ineffa's Ascension 1 passive. And I looked at, assuming that's the case and he's an attack scaler, and his overall team DPS is balanced to be similar to Skirk with the premium team with Ineffa, I made up some numbers for his motion value for him. And then I took a look at how much worse the overall team DPS would be if you replaced Ineffa with Bennett. And the gap that I got was generally somewhere between 10 and 20% worse, assuming that Flynn's is an attack scaler. In other words, if these assumptions are reasonable, Ineffa won't be necessary for a Lunar Charge carry. But I don't know how reasonable the assumptions are, because Flynn's could be a carry that works like Kinich, where he's not reliant on you, like on the reaction damage, he's just reliant on the reaction actually getting triggered as a condition for a part of his kit. Or he could be a character that doesn't scale with attack. He could be a direct EM scaler. He could be an HP scaler, who knows? If he's an HP scaler, well, we don't have good HP buffers like Bennett is a good attack buffer. If he's an EM scaler, well, we do have EM buffers. Well, a significant part of Ineffa's kit is that she buffs EM. So losing out on the EM buff and Ineffa's personal damage, and you compare that to an alternative that doesn't have Ineffa's personal damage, it'll probably be a lot worse. The point I'm trying to make right now is when it comes to the long-term value for Ineffa, it is incredibly dependent on the specific direction they want to take with Flynn's kit. I think that Flynn's aside, just in default current teams, Ineffa is a fairly solid character that doesn't quite reach the heights of characters like Xingqiu, but that is actually strong enough to put a team on her back. In other words, she fulfills a fairly similar role to the role Xingqiu fulfills in freeze teams with the worst carries, right? In freeze teams with like Ganyu, freeze teams with Risley, the role Xingqiu is fulfilling is basically she's putting the team on her damn back. And it's not an insanely amazing team, but it is going to be clearing the content. I think that's kind of similar for Ineffa right now, where I wouldn't say that she has any team where she's, well, enabling a team of similar levels to what Xingqiu enables Skirk to be, but she is as important to the high investment performance of Taser teams as Xingqiu is to the high investment performance for freeze teams that do not use Skirk. Which means, well, depending on how good Flynn's is and how reliant he is on her, her value can go significantly up or basically stay unchanged. Remember, we get next patch beta leaks generally either the day of or the day after the patch. So when Ineffa drops, we'll get Flynn's leaks either the same day or the day after. And so unless you're considering getting Ineffa mainly for your current teams, if you're considering getting Ineffa as a way to enable a Taser Neuvillette team to be much stronger, and by the way, Taser Neuvillette with Ineffa is honestly going to be around the same level as Freeze Neuvillette. Or you're getting Ineffa so that you can pretend like your Sino team is being useful, right? An old Hydro or Electro carry that you like, but that isn't quite strong enough to be able to carry their team by themselves, and you put Ineffa on the team to basically remedy that. If that's the plan for you, then the Flynn's leaks won't matter. But if you're pulling Ineffa mainly for meta reasons to prepare for Noncry, I would highly recommend holding off until we actually get Flynn's leaks. And I'll make a first impressions video on Flynn's within the first week of the patch. So subscribe, make sure you keep an eye out for that video if you're interested. Anyway, that's a lot of yap for Ineffa because, like I said, it's so hard for me to evaluate her until we get those Flynn's leaks. Next, Citlali. I recorded the acid of Citlali a couple days ago, so any more in-depth exploration of Citlali's value, you can go watch that. It should be out by the time this video gets posted. But very short TLDR on Citlali. Citlali is a sort of character that is good and worth getting, but not necessary to get. A lot of her value is provided through quality of life, and just in terms of damage, getting Citlali doesn't actually tend to increase your melt carry's damage more than getting Constellation for them, whether it's C1 Arlecchino or cons on Mawika or Sig. But it's also not that much worse, and if you're someone who doesn't want to go for cons, then obviously you don't have something to compare it to. And her teams do tend to be a lot more comfortable because reaching her ER requirements is a lot easier, and the timing for application tends to be easier, and the application happens around you, so if the enemies move, your application moves with you. So there's a lot of like quality of life upsides to Citlali, and those are honestly the main things. Other than that is the 4-stars. Let's get Sethos out of the way. Sethos is not very good. There are not a lot of good 4-star carries, and Sethos is definitely one of the better ones, but there's a few problems. Number one, Sethos is very difficult to play to a level that makes him decent. And number two, even if you do play him at that level, he was fairly alright before Natlan. And then Natlan came out, and the like average expectation for the DPS output of a meta team went up, and Sethos just doesn't really keep up anymore. Sethos isn't awful. Like I said, he is one of the better 4-star carries, but he's also generally not good enough to justify building unless you're on an Omega new account where you just only have one good carry. One nice thing about Sethos is that he does have synergy with Ineffa, right? He is a direct EM scaler, which means you actively want to build EM and you benefit from EM. So Ineffa's EM buff is good, and his personal contribution to Lunar Charged damage will be fairly high. But the problem is that unless the electro carry is really good, it might be difficult for them to perform better than on-fielding an Animo with Fischl. But one nice thing is that if you're on a relatively new account, you can actually play these 4 units together, and that's a functional and honestly pretty decent team. Though you're probably better off replacing Sethos for Sucrose if you have her. Sethos' constellations are useful. C1 doesn't do too much because you don't really do a lot of actual shadow piercing shots at C1. C2 is a little bit of electro damage percent, it's nice. C3 is normal attack talents, which is worthless because most of his damage is the normal attacks he does during the burst, but the scaling on those normal attacks is mainly concentrated in the burst talent, not the normal attack talent. So this is mainly an increase to the shadow piercing shot EM scaling, which like I said, you don't tend to do that much at low con anyways. C4, a little bit of EM in AoE, it's okay. C5 is burst talent levels, which is a little bit better, but it's still not that amazing because, well, he is an EM scaler, but that also means that he's doing reaction damage, which doesn't get increased by talent levels. And finally, C6 is arguably his best constellation. It gets him a free shadow piercing shot that doesn't cost energy once per rotation. It's pretty nice. But because Sethos teams generally have their damage split between multiple different characters rather than concentrated fully on Sethos' personal damage, then increasing his damage a little bit through cons doesn't matter as much. So his cons are like, they're not bad, but they're also not great. Anyways, Sethos done. Let's talk about the actual meat and potatoes of the banner, which is Fischl and Xingqiu. So first, we'll talk about Xingqiu. Xingqiu is not what he used to be. The landscape of the meta has changed a lot in Natlan. Xingqiu is one of the characters that took the biggest hit. There are 3 main things provided by Xingqiu. 1, he provides very good hydro application. 2, he provides fairly reasonable off-field damage. And 3, he provides defensive utility. But all 3 of the things that he provides are much less appealing now than they were a year and a half ago. So first, the very fast hydro application. Pretty much all the good pyro carries they've released lately have fairly slow application and are not reliant on Xingqiu's fast hydro. Many of them have application slow enough that they can even be played in melt teams. So obviously, Xingqiu's balls to the walls hydro application ends up being wasted. You just don't need it, right? Unlike older pyro carries like Hu Tao that applied a lot more pyro, so you actively needed a lot more application to keep reacting their damage. Outside of pyro carries, the teams that require a hydro application are not electro charge teams, because electro charge applying more hydro doesn't really help that much. Applying hydro twice or once doesn't change the electro charge damage really, as long as you have enough hydro to maintain uptime, which most hydro off-fielders do. In free teams, doesn't matter that much because, well, as long as you have one hydro, you probably have enough uptime, and especially with the release of Xingqiu being a good cryo healer, if you have Farina, that's generally who you want to use for your freeze teams. And the only thing that really leaves you with is Bloom teams, right? Bloom Nilo, Bloom Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon. Xingqiu is actually good in Nilo teams, but Nilo teams in 2025 are pathetic. Burgeon teams aren't real, and Xingqiu is still good in Hyper Bloom teams. But Hyper Bloom teams didn't get any real upgrades pretty much since Nahida. And with Natlan's power creep, Hyper Bloom teams are still good, but they're getting less and less competitive. Things might change with the release of Lunar Bloom. We'll have to see how that goes. But for now, unfortunately, not that great. Ineffa does give you some more options, but I'm not entirely sure yet how good Ineffa is going to be in Hyper Bloom. Anyways, that was the first aspect of Xingqiu that was good, his great Hydro application, and I've explained how it's a lot less relevant than it used to be. Second aspect is the off-field damage. And unfortunately, that also is a lot less relevant than it used to be, because carries, more and more, are getting inflated numbers. And those inflated numbers mean that if you have a 30% attack buff, that ends up increasing your carry's overall DPS by about 10%. If your carry at a baseline is at 50k DPS, 10% more is gonna bring you to 55, and that's 5k DPS. But if your carry at a baseline is 100k, 10% more is 10k instead. Which means carry power creep makes it so when it comes to old characters, the value of the old characters that buff goes up because the amount of damage you gain from that buff goes up. But the value of old characters that have personal damage stays static. It doesn't change. In other words, more and more off-field damage dealers are kind of meh. They're not really gonna bring as much to your team as buffers generally. And so because of that, Xingqiu's fairly decent off-field damage matters less than it used to. And the third thing is the defensive utility, right? A mix of tiny little bit of healing that doesn't matter too much, but mainly damage reduction and resistance to interruption. But they keep giving us carries that have either infinite or pseudo-infinite resistance to interruption, right? Malika, Skirk, Verissa for most of her rotation. And they keep releasing more alternatives for defensive utility, right? You've got Escaffi's healing, and they're also increasing DPS requirements in ways where sacrificing team DPS for more comfort becomes harder and harder to justify. Which means that all three of the main things that Xingqiu is providing became much less valuable with the Natlan power creep. Does that make Xingqiu a bad unit? No, not at all. Xingqiu is still definitely one of the better units. He's still one of the best 4-stars, but pre-Natlan, I would have said that Xingqiu is definitely in the running for the best unit in the game. And now, I think it's not even close. But things aren't completely over. Xingqiu is still, by far, the best Hydro applicator in the game. We've had some bosses lately that reward application, but not Hydro application, right? Applications and hits, right? You look at the Cryo Automaton, the Overseer device, or you look at the Lava Dragon, right? Those are enemies that reward hits of a certain element. We don't have one for Hydro yet. If we ever do get one of those, Xingqiu's tongs are gonna go way up. He really is the GOAT for Hydro application. If we get more Pyro carries that are focused on high application, you might start needing fast off-field Hydros again for those. If we get more Bloom focused or Hyper Bloom focused characters, Lauma is supposed to be a Lunar Bloom character. We don't know exactly how that translates to Nilo teams or Hyper Bloom teams or Virgin teams yet, but we know that she is supposed to be a Lunar Bloom character. And in Dendro reactions, the speed of the Hydro application matters a ton more than it does in most other reaction teams. So Xingqiu's stonks could go way up from that as well. Even if you look at just stuff that's out right now, Xingqiu is still a fairly valuable unit to have that slots in pretty easily in a decent amount of meta teams. Xingqiu is still one of the better options for Vape Arlecchino if that's what you want to do. Xingqiu is still a fairly viable option for Skirk. And with the upcoming turtle in Siege and Onslaught next patch, I think people are going to realize just how much Xingqiu can help. The turtle can deal a decent amount of damage to you, so the damage reduction from Xingqiu is going to matter a lot. And also, the turtle is a freezable enemy, which means that the much faster off-field Hydro, paired with your fairly fast on-field Cryo from Skirk and your off-field Cryo from Escaffier, is going to give you much better freeze-up time with Xingqiu than with pretty much any other last slot in your Skirk teams. So I think people are really going to notice that difference against that. Outside of that, if you're doing 4-star only teams, Xingqiu is still the GOAT. All in all, I still consider Xingqiu to be a fairly good unit to get, but I'd say that old accounts that have a lot of teams will often end up not using him in their Abyss teams or their Siege and Onslaught teams. Xingqiu's comms are good, but I'd say that they're a bit worse than they used to be, because pre-Natlan meta, Xingqiu's personal damage was a significant factor in his relevance in teams, and now that's a lot less the case, and so the damage he gets from constellations matters less. That being said, C2 is Shred and Uptime, which is, I would say, his best constellation now. I think C6 used to be better, but higher ER requirements means you get less damage, and if his damage isn't that insane in the team to begin with, then it's not the end of the world. Whereas the higher Uptime and the Shred generally tends to matter more. His cons are still good though, like you still get nice little amount of damage from C3 and C6, but they're not nearly as important as they were before. And next up, we have Fischl. Fischl kind of got the reverse Xingqiu treatment. Fischl is a character that historically has always been like alright. He's never really been in the running for the best 4-star, but she's always been like among the strongest ones. But it's like every time there's relevant meta changes, there's something to keep Fischl relevant. Nowadays, Fischl mainly sees play in Chivalrous teams. Outside of Chivalrous teams, she could still be played in Aggravate, but Aggravate teams haven't really improved much since the end of Sumeru. In Chivalrous teams, Fischl is generally the best off-field Electra. Technically, if you can enable Auron and your carry is very powerful, Auron's damage is a lot worse, but he can wear Cinder City, so if your carry is strong enough, Auron can be slightly better than Fischl. But like as a default baseline, Fischl is the go-to Electro last slot in Chivalrous teams for Pyro carries. She's also usable with some Electro carries, like Clara in those Chivalrous teams, or outside of Chivalrous teams, right? In the Aggravate teams. She's also, obviously, going to stay relevant in Taser teams with Ineffa. Taser teams have always been a little sus for their last slot, right? Like you had your Animo, you have Xingqiu, you have Fischl, but your last slot has always been like, well, I guess I'll use Beidou, I guess I'll use Yai, I guess I'll use Auron, like whatever. Well, now it's gonna be, I'm definitely using Ineffa. And Fischl is now a bit more replaceable with Auron, but you'd still rather use Fischl because of her much better particle generation. And because of the fact that Ineffa's damage is mainly not damage that scales with damage percent. Her Lunar Charge damage doesn't get increased by Cinder City. But as Fischl's damage was starting to fall off a little at the start of Fontaine, even in Aggravate teams, they released Golden True. And as it started falling off a little bit at the end of Fontaine, they released Chevaleurs to give her a bunch of teams. And now as you know, they're starting to give us more and more alternatives to teams and a lot of powerful units that are going to be potentially better than your best Chivalrous team. They're now giving her another alternative in Ineffa teams. Fischl is a sort of character that even if she ends up falling out of the meta at some point, she'll come back eventually because she has something in her kit that is inherently incredibly valuable. Fischl's Ascension 4 passive that reapplies Electro every time you trigger an Electro-related reaction with your on-fielder effectively means that she has by far the best Electro application in the game, assuming that your on-field application lines up with the cooldown of Fischl's Ascension 4. Pyro application. Like, I could see a Pyro carry that is an EM scaler that's focused on overload damage that actively requires Fischl because no one else would be able to keep up with the aura. I could very much see that getting released. Anyways, Fischl's pretty good. When it comes to cons, the cons that matter the most are C2 and C6. You might be wondering, so Jeff, what do you mean C2? Don't you mean C3, the one that increases Oz damage? Honestly, at this point, I'm gonna be like so for real with you. Sure, the Oz damage being lower is a little annoying, but it doesn't tend to be that big of a problem. It doesn't tend to be the deciding factor on whether or not you clear something. But the increased AoE on using skill on C2, because the skill deployment, the skill cast, applies Electro an additional time, having it have a bigger AoE and making it easier for it to hit enemies and multiple enemies in AoE is generally a bigger deal for me in practice than the increased damage from this skill. And then the C6, not just for the damage, but also for the additional duration and slightly increased Electro application when you do normal attacks. But overall, Fischl is a character that's fairly strong at C0 and has relevant constellations. And so is Xingqiu. Because of that, I'd say that this is a pretty great banner for beginner players. Players that started very recently that are looking for a good second team. If you don't have too many 5 stars yet, your second and obviously third for Sage and Onslaught teams are going to be pretty limited. And when you're looking at 4-star only teams, Fischl and Xingqiu are incredibly important. So getting them and getting cons on them matters. And both of them have some staying power, right? They have some opportunity to stay relevant in the future. And on top of that, well, it's a team that makes sense with Ineffa. It's really weird that Citlali's here because Citlali's like no synergy whatsoever with any of this. But I guess if you ended up getting Mawika, you're considering getting Citlali, right? You start on the Mawika banner. Getting these characters can help make your second team a little bit better, but it's still a little cooked. And if you're a more like long-term focused player and you're just trying to make the premium teams for the strongest carries, you might not find use for Fischl or Xingqiu. So I'd say that generally for Citlali, the banner isn't that great, but for Ineffa, it's quite a good banner. And now we have the weapon banner. Oh boy. Starcallers Launch is like probably the biggest bait weapon in the game. I think a lot of people are under the impression that it's actually pretty solid. Starcallers Launch is an incredibly minor upgrade over TTDS in most teams, unless you're also getting constellations on Citlali. If you have Citlali C2, you can consider getting this as the next upgrade for your Citlali, but other than that, it's pretty much just not worth considering. And if you lose your 50-50 to it, it's going to be something that is technically not completely worthless, but I would probably rather have a random stat stick like Homa on my account than have a Starcallers Launch. And I'm a Homa hater, by the way. Fractured Halo is a pretty good weapon on Ineffa. The biggest doubt I have right now is, again, it depends on how Flynn's is designed, right? If Flynn's damage is just electro damage that gets increased when you trigger Lunar Charge or like when you have the cloud active or whatever, then getting this weapon for Ineffa on a Flynn's team won't be that insane of a deal. But if Flynn's has damage that is actually like directly Lunar Charge damage, like Ineffa's Ascension 4 passive, then Ineffa's SIG is gonna matter a lot more, right? Because what Ineffa's SIG is, it gives 40% more Lunar Charge damage to the whole party. If Flynn's damage is Lunar Charge damage, then it gets increased by a decent amount. It's not a multiplicative 40%, this gets added onto your EM multiplier. So in practice, it's generally somewhere between 15 and 25, but still. But yeah, like it's obviously pretty significant, and that's without accounting for the fact that it's the best weapon on Ineffa herself. I'd say overall, if you're planning on getting Ineffa's SIG and getting Ineffa's Constellation 1 are fairly similar. They both increase your team's Lunar Charge damage by a similar amount, but if you have really high ER requirements on your team, then Ineffa's signature loses a little bit of value because it doesn't give you any energy. And so weapons that do give you energy, especially the weapons that are Omega inflated value, like Kitane, which procs twice instead of once, since she has all-field skill damage. So you get 24 flat energy refund, not 12, which is an insane amount of value. Or Fav, especially if you pocket twice per rotation, also an insane amount of value. And when you compare Fractured Halo to that, it is better, but the gap isn't as big as when you have low ER requirements, when you're playing an electro carry and you have electro resonance and a bunch of electro particles to reduce Ineffa's ER requirements. If I had to choose between the two, by default, I'd lean a little bit more towards C1 than towards SIG, but I think they're both reasonable. I think they're fairly similar. But with the additional context of Starcallers Watch being the weapon that's on banner, I'd go for Con. 4-star lineup is, it's fine. Fav Warbow and Fav Codex are the like average Fav weapons. All the Fav weapons have the same effect, but some of the Fav weapons are much better or much worse just because of how Fav reliant characters of that weapon type are. Polearm characters are at the very top with by far the most polearm characters that are very Fav reliant. Then it's sword characters, and then pretty big gap, and then you have pretty much both bow characters and cavalist characters. They're useful and you're happy to see them on the banner, but they're not enough to jump for joy, let's just put it that way. Sturdy Bone, complete dog shit. It's basically Flute on steroids. It gives you basically a slight motion value increase on your normal attack after using a dash. But the reality is that the actual number increase is fairly low, so unless your character by default has fairly low numbers, this won't be good. Pretty much the only character right now where this is not completely dog shit is Chlorine, because she has a lot of fairly small numbers. But even then, you need to add dashes into your rotation, so it's not actually that good. And Chlorine has access to really strong critically options with Finale and Calamity of Eshu if you have shields. So Sturdy Bone is pretty much worthless. Mountain Bracing Bolt is alright. It's an ER weapon that gives you skill damage, but unfortunately it's pretty much only for Escoffier. Alright, they're releasing a skill-focused polearm character in Ineffa, but she doesn't do skill damage. Right, like technically she does, but her main source of damage is Lunar Charge untagged damage that doesn't benefit from damage percent. And then Sack Greatsword, it's whatever, but it's not good. So overall, the 4-star lineup I'd say is fairly average, maybe a little bit below average. It's not like completely worthless. You do have some useful Fav weapons, but they're not the two most important ones, and your other options just kind of aren't that useful. So I'd say that this weapon banner, if you are interested in getting Starcallers Watch and you're planning on getting either Ineffa or Lens, I can see Fractured Halo being a fine weapon to lose your 50-50 to, probably about average, including the value of the 4-star weapons. Like obviously if you get Ineffa, it's quite good, but if you don't end up getting Ineffa, I don't know if you'll be able to proc Fractured Halo on your other teams. Maybe you could use it on Zhongli in a Flynn's team if you don't get Ineffa, but yeah. If you are considering getting Fractured Halo for Ineffa, you are not happy seeing Starcallers launch, and the 4-star lineup is also not that great. And then, like I said earlier, character banner for Citlali, I'd say worse than average. For Ineffa, better than average. Right, just because of the inherent synergy, and because of the fact that Ineffa is a sort of character that you are definitely heavily considering on your accounts, because she single-handedly enables a team. Whereas with Citlali, generally, you're playing her on a team that is probably strong enough to clear content even without her. If you're pulling Citlali for Arlecchino has teams that can clear without her. If you're pulling Citlali for Maoika has teams that can clear without her. Especially if you're a new player, that means you got Maoika on her last banner. That means you got Yansan, so you don't need your Kwyo to be Nalan. So by default, Citlali is a character that's a lot less appealing to new accounts that don't have like 3 full teams yet. But those are generally the accounts that care about seeing Fischl and Xingqiu here. So for a Citlali banner, this doesn't make too much sense. You're not too happy to see these 4-stars for Citlali. So as usual, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed. Do all the good old YouTube stuff, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.